Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 60. Episode 60 is a continuation of episode 59. In today's episode, we tell those final parts of the story where we are transitioning from Parkland to Air Force One. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 60 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Regarding passengers, there was still more to come. Shortly, another wave of them would arrive, a mixture of Kennedy and Johnson people and the first group of those loyal to Kennedy. That group included Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's secretary, and the two ladies in waiting for Jackie Kennedy, the two ladies that were on the trip with her, Pam Turner and Mary Gallagher. Johnson's entourage added Mary Famer, who was Johnson's secretary, and Liz Carpenter, a former newspaper reporter turned Johnson confidant. All of them, too, were immediately feeling the oddity of being on the same plane together. They weren't used to mingling with one another. For this ride, though, the Kennedy clan would have a decidedly different final experience on Air Force One. The new president was gathering his entourage. Albert Thomas was the first to volunteer, saying, "We are ready to carry out any orders that you have, Mr. President." Cliff Carter made his way to a phone in the rear of the plane, calling his own wife and asking her to get in touch with the wife of Rufus Youngblood and to let her know that her husband was okay. Carter was aware of press reports that stated or implied that Secret Service agents had been shot. He wanted her to know right away that her husband was okay. Right in the middle of making the call, a hammering sound had begun. It was Sergeant Ayres, the airplane steward, and he was removing 2 rows of seats in the cabin to make room for the casket that would shortly be delivered to the plane. The TV was still on in the stateroom, and at 1:38 p.m., those who were inside it still watched Walter Cronkite make the news official with his now iconic and famous announcement of the president's death. Something the group on the plane already knew, but hearing it from Walter Cronkite was bone-chilling and confirming, because hearing any news from Walter Cronkite in those days seemed to make it true. Maybe even more truer in this case. Once Johnson got settled in and made his way to the presidential bedroom, he would begin making a series of important and historical calls. And we covered the most important of those in our last episode as he called Bobby Kennedy. Everyone on board began to feel the transition of power. Johnson's decision to go home on Air Force One and force the Kennedy and Johnson team members to all ride together on the same plane, well, it was already sending a message that the transition of power was swiftly underway. Johnson would engage in several more important calls besides the ones with Bobby Kennedy. The first is a call from McGeorge Bundy, President Kennedy's national security advisor. The second was from Walter Jenkins, one of Johnson's most trusted aides. Both men tell him that he should return to the Capitol immediately. And Johnson says he will not leave without Jackie Kennedy, and she has let it be known that she will not leave without her husband's body. So these events must happen then in sequence. Johnson will wait for Jackie and the president's body to arrive and be loaded. Johnson would further tell both of them that he does not want to be remembered as an abandoner of beautiful widows. By 1:43, Colonel Swindle radios Andrews Air Force Base telling them that they are standing by for takeoff. but no takeoff yet. Johnson would continue to make other calls, first calling Irving Goldberg, a lawyer and a friend. After a short discussion, they decide to ask U.S. District Court Judge Sarah T. Hughes to administer the oath of office of the president. Hughes was a longtime friend of Johnson, and he had contributed materially to her appointment to the federal bench. After the call to Goldberg, Johnson asked his secretary, Mary Famer, to call Hughes's office, and she does just that. But a law clerk tells her that the judge is not in and that he believes that she's at the Trade Mart, where she went to see President Kennedy make his speech. Famer hangs up and lets Johnson know that Hughes can't be found. Johnson responds, and he tells her to call the office back. But this time, Johnson grabs hold of the phone once they're patched through. He says but one thing to the recipient on the other end of that phone. This is Lyndon Johnson. Find her. About 12 minutes later, somewhere right around 2:02 p.m., Johnson's people finally get word that Judge Hughes has been located and that she was on her way to Air Force One. Cecil Stoughton knew that this was an epic moment in presidential history, in American history, indeed in world history. Getting a picture of it, the swearing in that is, would be something for posterity, something never before captured, and hopefully never again necessary. Stoughton decides to approach Liz Carpenter and Mary Famer. Sweating and ashen-colored from the heat in the cabin and the emotion of the moment, he asked them to ask the president. He would say that this is a history-making moment, and while it seems tasteless, I am here to make a picture if he cares to have it, and I think we should have it. About 12 minutes after 2:14 p.m., the white hearse carrying the president's body finally pulls up at the ramp near the rear of Air Force One. The hearse itself is followed by two other cars, and as they all come to a stop, a herd of Secret Service agents and Kennedy men exit from the vehicles. They include three Secret Service agents well known in this story already. In particular, they were Bill Greer, the driver of President Kennedy's limousine, Roy Kellerman, who had been in the front passenger seat with Greer and who was ostensibly in charge of the Secret Service men on the ground in Dallas for the visit, and Clint Hill, the man in charge of guarding Jackie Kennedy, who had sprinted forward to climb onto the back of the presidential limousine after the shots were fired. President Kennedy's closest advisors were now also there. They were following the hearse and were in the other two cars. They included the members of the Irish Mafia, his close network of lifetime friends and Boston confidants, Kenny O'Donnell, Larry O'Brien, and Dave Powers. These men were there for the whole thing. In fact, Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers saw the whole thing. The horrific moment the shots were fired. Powers himself would have his own horrific badge made of that day. His brown suit had a blood stain that was easy to spot, no doubt caused by when he had helped to get the president in or out of Parkland. Dr. Berkeley, President Kennedy's personal physician, was also there with that group, as was General McHugh. Another one of Kennedy's military aides, General Ted Clifton, was also in the group. Together, they would remove the giant bronze casket from the hearse, a casket that was now tasked with carrying the president back to Washington. As many of them as there were, these men collectively struggled to get the 800-pound casket up the incline of the ramp and into Air Force One. But every one of them was determined to be a part of their own personal funeral procession that was to be recorded for history as they carried the president's body not to his grave, but out of the killing zone that had caused his demise. These loyal men would have their very own and very personal public moment of doing that. They hoisted this massive edifice up over their shoulders and struggled to keep it upright and balanced as they made their way up in an awkward, unrehearsed, and wobbly fashion on the ramp. The casket itself was so big that, without alteration, it would not fit through the door of Air Force One. But the casket was getting on. Just like the fight that had just been had at Parkland over the president's body, there was no stopping this group. The president was getting on this plane for his last flight on Air Force One. They would quickly retrieve the axe on the plane. There is one of them on every plane like that. And they would go to work on the handles of the casket, chopping them off and providing just enough clearance to now get the casket through the door and onto Air Force One, and then secured in the spot where Sergeant Ayres had removed the seats in order to accommodate it. Of course, the most important living passenger in that three-vehicle entourage was there too. Jackie Kennedy was in the back of the hearse, riding with her husband's body, and she too followed the casket up the steps, heading straight for the bedroom. What she found next was shocking. There in the presidential bedroom was Johnson, Mary Famer, and Rufus Youngblood. And depending on the account of this story, Johnson was either still on the bed or had just lifted himself off of it. His crass behavior was a lifelong trait, and it came out over and over during one of the most crushing moments of world history. Still, it was at a moment's notice in the same event that these crass actions were followed by tender words or deeds of support, in a way to recompense. But his behavior, even for those that knew him, was filled often with these dichotomies, and as a result, it was always tough to determine what was real and what was merely a cover for the dark feelings that were undoubtedly always circulating underneath. It was purely a mystery when it came to assessing the true feelings, motives, and actions of Lyndon Johnson. All four of them, now in the bedroom together, were mortified, and all four of them, then retreated out of the bedroom for that moment. Jackie made her way to the aft cabin next to the casket, while Johnson and his group made their way to the stateroom. That moment in the bedroom had been awkward for Johnson, and for the others too. Johnson knew he had to recompense of sorts, so he located Ladybird, and together they returned to find Jackie, convincing her to go back into the bedroom. The Johnsons then sat with her on one end of the bed and engaged in a personal moment of sorrow and comfort. As a part of that private moment, Ladybird in later years would recount what she wrote in her personal diary, what she said to Jackie at that moment. And in later years, it would come to be known as another awkward thing said by a Johnson to Jackie in a most awkward moment. "Oh, Mrs. Kennedy," Ladybird says, "you know, we never even wanted to be vice president, and now, dear God, it's come to this." As you might expect, there was nothing for Jackie to say of this comment, and she didn't. The conversation continued between the Johnsons and Jackie as they all sat on the bed. Jackie appeared in shock, and then she said, "Oh, what if I had not been there? I was so glad I was there." And then again, right away, came a most inappropriate remark as Ladybird struggled for the right thing to say to Jackie. "I don't know what to say," Ladybird would say. "What wounds me most of all is that this should happen in my beloved state of Texas." To this again, Jackie said nothing. She was stunned and maintained her silence. Her pink outfit, stained with the gore of the event, her clothes still contained fragments of her husband's skull and brain. One of her stockings was almost completely lacquered in blood. Her right glove, white that morning, is caked and stiff with it. Her left glove is missing. Ladybird asks her if she can get someone to help her change. "No," Jackie says. "Perhaps later I'll ask Mary Gallagher, but not right now. I want them to see what they have done to Jack." The Johnsons then tell Jackie about their plans for the swearing in. after that revelation, it's time to leave her, and they then do just that. Jackie remains in the bedroom on that same spot in her bed, or at least her bed for the final time. She stares at the walls and looks around the room, and she decides it's time to unbutton and take off the single remaining glove she has on, the one covered with blood. And then she does what she would sometimes continue to do in a very private moment. She lights herself a cigarette, and the furrowing smoke of it adds to the tale and the morosity of the moment in the presidential bedroom. Meanwhile, now that the president's body and Jackie Kennedy were safely on board Air Force One, Ken O'Donnell was desperate to take off. He had just undergone a fight at Parkland to keep the president's body. Who knows what was next? Would the Dallas police decide to stop the plane from taking off and commandeer the body for autopsy? That would put Jackie over the edge, and O'Donnell knew it. Little did he know that Jesse Curry was on the plane, and that was not going to happen. But in his own words, O'Donnell would say at that moment, "I was petrified." And he was afraid Jackie was going to have a heart attack too. He himself was close to the edge. O'Donnell was the president's rightest right-hand man, and he was used to being in charge in the White House and getting what he wanted when it came to carrying out the president's wishes. In his next move, he heads toward the cockpit, and on the way he runs into General McHugh, ordering the general to get the plane in the air. But Kenny O'Donnell is no longer in charge. Little did he know that the new president had already given an order directly to McHugh to tell Swindle to keep the plane grounded for now. And he did. There was one more important order of business to be completed before they put the airplane in the air. It was the swearing in of the new president. Later, O'Donnell would reflect on those moments and realize that for Johnson, the swearing in was something very personal. Obviously, it would be to any president, but for him, Johnson wanted his longtime friend, Judge Sarah Hughes, to be the one to do it. And if they left Dallas without her doing it, well, it would likely not happen that way. The chance would be lost. So Johnson acted, like so many times in his life, decisively to save the moment for himself. Johnson tells the story differently, but there is no doubt that was at least one of his personal motivations in the circumstance. Regardless, they were not taking off from Love Field until the ceremony was completed. By this time, Malcolm Kilduff, the assistant White House press secretary, had made his way back to Air Force One from Parkland, and he was now escorting 3 pool reporters onto the plane in rapid succession behind Judge Hughes' arrival. They were Sid Davis of Westinghouse Broadcasting, Merriman Smith of UPI, and Charles Roberts of Newsweek. As they made their way onto the plane, the presence of Judge Hughes and now 3 principal reporters from the press pool, well, that seemed to be Johnson's cue to get the show on the road, and he did. Seeing them all now on the plane, Johnson then rose from the gold-upholstered chair that he was sitting in the stateroom, and he seemed to be ready to be sworn in. Johnson would then say, "If there's anybody else aboard who wants to see this, tell them to come in." The stateroom begins to fill. The temperature continues to climb. Almost suffocating are the words that Charles Roberts of Newsweek would later use to describe the physical atmosphere in the room. In one of the earlier phone calls that took place in the presidential bedroom, Nicholas Katzenbach had read the oath out loud, and Mary Famer had dutifully transcribed it on the other end. She was ready now and handed it to the judge. But they still needed a Bible to administer the oath, and Larry O'Brien would look at Jackie and excuse himself to then go find the only thing on board that was close enough for the task at hand. It was a Catholic missal that he found after rummaging in the nightstand in the bedroom. It was most likely a gift, and it was in its original box, never having been used. In a moment, O'Brien had the box open, the missile out, and was back in the stateroom, handing it over to Judge Hughes. But wait, there was one person still missing from the scene. It was Jackie Kennedy. Kenny O'Donnell was already in the stateroom for the swearing in when Johnson looked around and then looked at Kenny. "Would you ask Mrs. Kennedy to come stand here?" Johnson obviously wanted Jackie Kennedy to stand beside him at the swearing-in ceremony, a real symbolic moment, adding legitimacy to his new role. It was calculated. He would be with the wife of the slain president right there beside him. O'Donnell couldn't believe what Johnson was asking for. He responded back, "You can't do that. The poor little kid has had enough for one day. To sit here and hear that oath that she heard a few years ago, you just can't do that, Mr. President." "Well," Johnson says, "she said she wanted to do it." O'Donnell wasn't satisfied by this response from Johnson. He kept at it with the new president. "I just don't believe that," O'Donnell said as he headed to the bedroom, knowing that he now had to ask Jackie, but wanting to publicly make one more objection for others to hear of this seemingly outrageous request by the new president. Later, he would describe his own state as hysterical over this request, pacing in the hallway with his hands on his head. But finally, he walked into the bedroom, and Jackie was combing her hair. He turned to her and asked, "Do you want to go out there?" "Yes," Jackie replied. "I think I ought to. At least I owe that much to the country." What a moment she gave to us all. And we should forever be thankful. At 2:37 p.m. Central Standard Time, Jackie Kennedy came out of the bedroom and entered the stateroom where folks had been waiting patiently for the outcome of this entrance. The participants in the room now offer up silence, just as at a wedding or a funeral. Earlier, she had removed the one remaining bloody glove, but she had decided not to change her clothes. There were 27 observers in the stateroom that day on Air Force One. They were packed in like sardines. The iconic pictures were taken as a photographer would at a wedding or a press event, with Cecil Stoughton directing the participants. Stoughton would climb up on the couch and lean against a wall in a contortion that was necessary to get as good of a perspective as he could in such a short room filled with so many people. He had a new Hasselblad 50mm lens. For those of you who know lenses, Hasselblad is as good as you can get. But at 50mm, this lens had a normal perspective. It was not a wide-angle lens. So even shooting from higher up at a downward angle would leave the scene basically undistorted, which was good. But with a normal lens, he was still having trouble getting all the key players included within the shot. "You're going to have to back off just a little bit if I'm going to get you all in," he says to Johnson and the foursome at the center of the portrait. And at Stoughton's command, they would all push back into the watching crowd. Most of them couldn't hear Judge Hughes as she administered the oath, as the plane's engines were now coming to life and contributing their own whirling noise to the scene. Johnson, interestingly enough, chose to swear rather than affirm the oath, adding, for good measure, 4 words that are not in the oath. "So help me God." He then turned and kissed Lady Bird on the forehead. She was nearly in tears. She, in turn, grabs Jackie's hands, and finally, in a fitting momentary comment, she says to Jackie, "The whole nation mourns your husband." The ensuing moments would be similar to a press conference with the crowd dispersing after a press photo. Johnson begins to shake hands with the congressman, the pool reporters, and his staff. These individuals that were in the room and experienced the moment with he and Lady Bird. Cecil Stoughton took many pictures that day, and in some of the lesser-known ones, there is more than one smiling face in the crowd. In some ways, a perplexing thing. But in the world of emotionless politics, I guess it's to be expected. A lifetime of achievement crowned at that moment for Lyndon Johnson, because, at least momentarily, it was a moment of great joy, regardless of how it was obtained. It was an historical event of sorts in other ways, too. It had been a long time since a man from a southern state had been president of the United States. In fact, Lyndon Johnson had just become the first southern president since Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. Andrew Johnson succeeded to the office after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. How ironic and ominous, perhaps, too, that a southern man named Johnson succeeded in both cases after the assassination of a most beloved president. And with both Johnsons, in the early aftermath of the killings, suspected of being involved in the plots to kill the president. There were more ironies than this, but these were certainly on the tip of the tongue in that coming week after the capture of Oswald and his killing by Ruby. Among the many people caught in the famous photograph is the man carrying the nuclear codes, contained in a steel briefcase and handcuffed to his wrist. A man never too far away from the current president. On that day, he was a stone's throw away from both, one dead and one alive. There were many in the military who wondered if anything more would happen that day. Would he be needed and pressed into service if they found that the Russians had done it and were going to do more? As the ceremony came to an end, Chief Curry leaned in toward Jackie. "God bless you, little lady," he would say in a vernacular that displayed his Southern upbringing and genuine desire to comfort her. "But you ought to go back and lie down." "No, thanks. I'm fine," she would answer back, and then she would make her way back to the aft cabin where she took a seat beside her husband's casket. For the rest of the flight, she would not move from it. Moments later, at 2:47 p.m., Air Force One would be airborne, and Colonel Swindle pointed the aircraft as close to vertical as a Boeing 707 could fly safely in a maneuver that enhanced the security of the takeoff. Some people on the ground would describe it as being almost straight up and down. President Johnson had never flown on Air Force One, despite asking on many occasions. He always wanted the political value of emerging with the president as they left the plane, photographed together possibly, and clearly conveying power to the vice president. But it was never to be. President Kennedy had always brought up security concerns, citing that the president and the vice president should not travel on the same plane. This irked Johnson. Well, today that would be different. Now he was the president, the living president, and the dead president was now on his plane. How privilege can be turned upside down so quickly in the world of power politics. And not bad for a man who had derisively been called Rufus Cornpone by his more polished northern Kennedy comrades. A moniker that they would give this southern man, which represented his socially crude ways and his unpolished and roughshod approach to things, at least in their eyes. But Johnson was in power now, and whatever they called him behind his back, Rufus Cornpone, or even something worse, well, in the light of day and to his face, he was now Mr. President.
Today we're here at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, and we had a visit from Mr. Sid Davis, who is a press pool reporter on the day that President Kennedy was assassinated in November 23rd, 1963. He was one of the three members of the press who were actually permitted on the aircraft for the inauguration of President Johnson.
We heard the shots clearly. I heard three distinct shots. My seatmate on the press bus was Bob Pierpoint of CBS, who had covered the war in Korea. So He knew what gunfire sounded like. We thought at first it was a motorcycle backfire from one of the many motorcycles alongside of us in the motorcade. Bob Pierpoint jumped out of his seat and said, "That's gunfire." And within seconds, we looked up ahead of our bus, and we saw a commotion at the presidential limousine area. The distance between us and the car was about 80 feet. And so we saw the crowds then responding to the gunfire by charging through the motorcade cars to get to one side of the street or the other. They didn't know where to go for safety. They heard the shots. They saw the commotion in the presidential limousine. There was a grassy knoll, they called it, grassy area where I saw a father place his child down on the grass and placed his body on top of the child because they didn't know what was happening, but he knew he had heard shots and gunfire. So he placed his body on top of his child. We went to the Trade Mart. I ran and found a telephone. There were 2,000 people in the Trade Mart waiting for the president to arrive. They didn't know what happened. They just saw a herd of reporters rushing through the hall looking for telephones. I grabbed a phone, called Washington to my office. They said, "The president's at Parkland Hospital. Get there as soon as you can." I first tried to get into the emergency room, and I couldn't. I was under seal. I saw the Secret Service agents cleaning up the back seat of the limousine. Clint Hill was one of them, cleaning up the rear seat where the blood and parts of the president's brain were on the seat. My friend Hugh Sidey of Time magazine had talked to Clint a few minutes before I got there, and I think Hugh Sidey, White House correspondent for Time, asked Clint, who was a friend of ours, how's the president? And Clint said, "He's dead." Just like that. I had to repeat the pool report so many times that day, filing my story. While I was filing, a White House official grabbed me and took me aside while I was live on the air, and I said, "I can't talk to you now, I'm on the air." And he said, "You have to come with me." And I said, "I can't come with you, I'm on the air." And he said, "No." I used some profanity, trying to get him loose. He was holding my suit collar, pulling me away. And finally, I just went with him. I said goodbye on the air. "I'll talk to you later." And I went with him, and they took me downstairs with two other reporters, Merriman Smith of the United Press International, the senior correspondent at the White House, and Chuck Roberts of Newsweek. They're both good friends of mine. Actually, they were mentors. They were older. They'd covered World War II as combat correspondents. They were wonderful friends. And we, three of us, were placed into an unmarked police car, and we were raced to Love Field. Police officer driving was doing about 70, 75 miles an hour to get to the airport because we didn't know whether Air Force One had taken off yet or not. But President Johnson wanted the press on that airplane. He wanted the press to be aboard to witness the swearing in, which is probably a very wise decision to have witnesses to this thing, for history and for just the facts, the real facts, so there are no rumors about what took place. And we arrived at Air Force One when they were placing the casket aboard. Mrs. Kennedy was helping the Secret Service put the casket on board the airplane. The casket would not fit through the hatches. It was too wide. It was a 600-pound bronze casket. The agents went inside and got an axe from inside. The airplanes do have an axe aboard. And they took the axe and they knocked the handles off the airplane. I don't know whether there's 4 or 6 handles. And they knocked the handles off. They got it through the hatchway door. I heard the president ask Marie Famer, his secretary, to go and ask Mrs. Kennedy if she would like to stand with him for the swearing in. And she sent word that she did, but she needed a few minutes to compose herself. And after a few minutes, Mrs. Kennedy appeared into the conference room. And then at that point, I saw the gravity of the situation. I saw what she had witnessed on her clothing. Her suit, this beautiful raspberry-colored two-piece wool suit, had the markings of the terrible thing that had happened. Pieces of the president's skull, flesh, blood on her clothing splattered. I looked at Mrs. Kennedy's stockings, and the right stocking was heavily congealed with blood where she had cradled his head in her lap. On the left leg, there was not as much, but there was blood on her left stocking, too. And I realized what she had endured. She kept up her courage. She was aware of what was going on. She knew what had happened. She felt it was her place to be in that picture. I forever believe that it was part of her patriotism, really, that she felt it was necessary. At some point on the flight, when asked by an aide of hers, Mrs. Kennedy, would you like to clean up while we're en route back to Washington? And Mrs. Kennedy said, no, I want them to see what they have done. And those words are reverberated throughout the history of the assassination. Well, you can't help but feel a great deal of emotion when you stand here in the airplane. That 1963, we're talking well over 50 years, 54 years, 53 or 54 years. I've not forgotten any part of what took place on the airplane. It's as fresh in my mind today as it was back then, because I've been asked to tell the story so often. But I never believed that when I was a young reporter in Ohio, Youngstown, Ohio, that I would ever cover a story of this magnitude. I never believed that I would be a pool reporter where it was my responsibility with two other reporters to remember everything that happened so we could report back to the rest of the press that covered President Kennedy's trip to Dallas. The assassination has a lot to do with the impact of Kennedy's involvement with the airplane. Of course, the assassination is a big part of it. And the fact that the casket was carried aboard Air Force One back to Washington. There's no way you can erase the history of it. And it's associated a lot with Kennedy because Mrs. Kennedy was involved in the design of it. It still remains the same. The pattern of the even on the 747, the pattern pretty much resembles what this airplane looks like. To many people in foreign lands, this is the United States. So, and it shows the power and strength. That's what it shows. It's a very powerful looking airplane.
Thank you for listening to episode 60 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 61. In today's episode, we continue the epic transition from Parkland Hospital to Air Force One and the ensuing trip back to Andrews Air Force Base. We cover the time on the plane and a number of epic and related events, including the moment when Robert Kennedy heard the news about his brother. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 61 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Hickory Hill was where Bobby and Ethel Kennedy lived. It was the name of a beautiful Civil War-era home that was located just outside of D.C. in McLean, Virginia. Bobby had purchased the home from his brother Jack in 1957 in a fitting transition as both moved up the political ladder in Washington. It was beautiful, and it was situated close enough for Robert to commute back and forth from home to the downtown offices of the Justice Department. It was a fitting home for a Kennedy with its lush location and old-world elegance, and it came with its own history, too. In 1941, prior to the Kennedys' ownership, it became the home of a newly appointed United States Supreme Court Justice, Robert H. Jackson. It was a fitting place for the large and growing family of Bobby and Ethel Kennedy, who would eventually have 11 children. They were good Catholics, all right. On Wednesday of that week, just 2 days before the assassination, Bobby had celebrated his 38th birthday. His brother was the most powerful man in the world. By virtue of that connection, his official role as the Attorney General of the United States may have placed him in the second most powerful role in the country, and certainly one of the most powerful men in the world. That year, it was still warm enough in Northern Virginia on the 22nd of November to have lunch outside around the pool in the back of Hickory Hill. Bobby and Ethel and others were gathered to enjoy what surely would have been one of the last good weather days before old Jack winter began to set in. The world had its challenges, and the Kennedy men had already faced down some of the most dangerous moments in history that had occurred during the latter part of the 20th century. The Cuban Missile Crisis had brought the Soviet Union and the United States dangerously close to a nuclear war. These two men had skillfully avoided the annihilation that would have taken place, and that surely would have affected the entire world and the course of human history as we know it. The ramifications of that to the story of the JFK assassination are already set, with actions already in motion. Actions that may have taken JFK's life, and in the end, maybe Bobby's too. But on that November day, a lunch was celebratory, as the tumult of the world was secondary to the height of the political perch that these two men enjoyed, and the extraordinary power and influence that came with it, and the power that these two extraordinary men were now wielding as the country and the world barreled toward a new era, and just decades away from a new millennium. Old thinking was giving way to new thinking, but it was accompanied by a terrible gnashing of the teeth culturally and a terrible dose of underlying violence that would define the 1960s as the decade that cradled the bloody pivot of our souls in this country. As they sat eating lunch, the phone would ring. It was J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. Ethel would answer and then quickly turn it over to Bobby. In a terse call, he would inform Bobby Kennedy that the president had been shot, but that they had very little details on what was happening or how bad the wound was. In typical Hoover style, he would offer no personal comment, and the call would end abruptly. Instantly, Bobby Kennedy was running on adrenaline. He knew his brother had been shot, but he wasn't sure what the outcome was. He was upstairs in a dash now at the Hickory Hill house, and he was trying to get himself dressed to go to Dallas. There were pictures of the family upstairs all over, and they were on the walls of this beautiful home. He was staring at them and into them. There was all sorts of family history portrayed in those pictures, including some with his oldest brother, Joe Kennedy Jr., who had died in World War II. And there were pictures of his sister, Kathleen Kennedy, as well. She, too, had already passed from this earth. While he was trying to dress, his wife Ethel had made her way upstairs, and shortly after that came John McCone, a trusted Kennedy confidant who had been chosen to run the CIA after the firing of Allen Dulles in the midst of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. McCone was visiting with Bobby that day at Hickory Hill. He would enter the room and ask Bobby if he knew yet how serious the wound was that JFK had suffered, and Robert Kennedy answered back with a simple, "No, I don't." At just about that moment, a special phone began to ring in the bedroom. It was a direct extension back to the White House. Bobby grabbed the phone. At first, he thought the caller was Clint Hill, who was the Secret Service agent that was charged with taking care of Jackie. But it turned out to be Taz Shepard, Naval Commander Tazewell Taylor Shepard, whose official title was military aide to the president. In the trauma that he was most certainly undergoing, Bobby Kennedy became confused as to who had called him. It was now that the real news came. For many of us who are old enough, we have either been on the telephone ourselves and received shocking personal news that way, or have been with someone who was on the telephone and receiving shocking news. Just like the Kennedys on that day, in that bedroom that day, at that moment, as humans, the most dreaded news was now here. And Robert was now on the end of the receiver hearing it fresh and raw. The first time he would receive the crushing news of the death of his brother. And he would cry out, "He's dead." Shortly, the three of them, Robert Kennedy and his wife Ethel and McCone, would begin to make their way downstairs. They had other guests there at Hickory Hill that day, some there already and some already gathering because of the news. The small group in the living room included Robert Morgenthau, a friend of Bobby's and the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And as they got to the foot of the stairs, Robert would turn to the group that was gathered in the living room watching the incoming news on television and say one simple thing more. He died. Bobby quickly turned and headed toward the pool. He needed air and a momentary escape, and by the time he got to the pool, the phone extension out there began ringing. It was J. Edgar Hoover again. It was another short conversation. He would simply tell Bobby that the president was dead. It would be news that Bobby already knew. Hoover then hung up abruptly. It was a conversation that was devoid of any sort of humanity. He delivered the message, and he delivered it with virtually no emotion at all. His voice, as the Attorney General himself recalled afterward, was not quite as excited as if he were reporting the fact that he had found a communist on the faculty of Howard University. Many people believe that in the JFK assassination, Hoover finally got what he wanted, and, as a result, he would no longer have to bow to Bobby Kennedy. The conversation that day was curt, at best. In reality, it was probably just plain cold. Hoover loathed the man that he had just given the information to, and it was no never mind to him that he was telling the man that his brother was dead. Certainly all the leaders of the world were in a serious circumstance at that moment, and men in those roles, including Hoover, had heavy burdens at that very time. But at the end of the day, there was still time for humanity. But here, none was extended. For anyone who has ever been stunned by a terrible tragedy like this, there is a whole host of reactions that might be elicited by a person in Bobby Kennedy's position. It was his choice right then to fight the rising tide of emotions, and at least at this moment to stay completely focused and composed, knowing that he was no longer by himself or just with Ethel and McCone. And so he began to try and drill down on things he could do at that moment and not to sink in his own agony and despair. That would most certainly come for him, and it did, and it took him to a deep depth of darkness and mourning, but not in those hours and days right after the assassination. He was like steel then. His first thoughts were to go to Dallas and be with Jackie and fly back with her. But events were moving too fast for that. In a terribly telling punctuation of the hate that Hoover felt for Robert Kennedy, in the 9 months after the assassination of JFK, the 9 months that Robert remained in his presidential cabinet role as the Attorney General of the United States, even though Hoover and Kennedy's office were both on the same floor at the Justice Department, Hoover never came down the hall to spend even a few minutes to offer a personal condolence to Robert Kennedy over the loss of his brother. Men are curious about these things, especially powerful men. And there are some men who have hearts of gold but cannot fathom a discussion about such things. And so the absence of a conversation in those relationships does not constitute ill will or malice. But the circumstance was different here between Robert Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover. The personal force field that prevented Hoover himself from making his way down to that office was born of a very visceral hatred for Robert Kennedy, and perhaps the Kennedys as a whole, but certainly Robert. In the wake of such tragedies, it may seem odd to some of us who live more common lives as to what things are in need of being attended to at that very moment. Bobby Kennedy, among the calls that he made that afternoon at Hickory Hill, was one made to McGeorge Bundy, who was the slain president's national security advisor. They had a discussion about President Kennedy's personal papers, and it was determined that legally, when a president dies in office, his personal papers belong to his personal estate. That is, they are not presidential papers owned by the government. Based on this assessment, Bobby would quickly take actions to change the combination to the locks of at least one safe where documents were being held. To this day, many of us wonder what was in that safe, or safes, and in those documents, and where are they today? Either destroyed or packed deeply in the Kennedy's family attic, and no doubt still under some form of lock and key somewhere, if they exist at all. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, there were concerns building from General Maxwell Taylor. Taylor was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. With no one knowing exactly who or what had been initiated as part of the assassination, or whether or not this was a broader conspiracy and whether or not there was more coming from the Russians, well, this was all problematic to the military for sure. One of the most important things to do, the first order of business, was to ensure that the satchel carrying the nuclear codes was safe. And he knew it would be, because he knew he could count on the Signal Corps to put the bag in close proximity to the new commander-in-chief. Unfortunately, Johnson had not been briefed. He knew that such a bag existed all right, but he had no idea what the protocols were. And if there had been an immediate need for some form of war strike, some form of retaliation that required immediate action, well, it was quite possible that the country's retaliatory arsenal strike could be held up until he had been led through instructions by Taz Shepard, instructions that he would be receiving for the first time under the most utmost of pressure and circumstances. Fortunately for all of us and for the rest of the world, at that moment there was no need. We don't know what goes on inside the command centers and what protocols are exactly deployed by the superpowers in order to make the split-second decision of whether an international showdown is happening and underway. It's probably good that we don't. It's also probably essential. Nevertheless, the football that was being held by Ira Gearhart that day was a real thing, even back then. And it was there safe and sound and within the clutches of both the dead president and the living one. Before the plane had taken off, those that were in the stateroom of Air Force One were updated with news that entailed an interesting turn of events. It was now being reported that the police had entered a theater in Dallas and arrested a man for the killing of a policeman, Officer J.D. Tippit. They were also learning that this man that had been detained was the only man missing from a head count that had been taken by the supervisor at the Texas Schoolbook Depository, a building right there in Dealey Plaza where the shooting had taken place. These pieces were beginning to come together. There seemed to be a man that was clearly involved in the shooting. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. Up in the cockpit of Air Force One, and before the plane had taken off, Andrews Air Force Base radioed, eager to find out the plane's plan. "What is your estimated time of departure?" "In a few minutes," the crew responded. Do you have any passengers aboard? Full load, 40 plus. Is Mrs. Kennedy aboard? Affirmative. They were ready to go, and that was happening just as the swearing-in ceremony was ending and the roar of the jet's engines was powering up. Not everyone on the plane got to see the swearing-in. There were 27 observers in the stateroom at the time of the ceremony, but there was a total of about 40 passengers on the plane's manifest. I say about 40 because after the fact, the manifest, which was hastily prepared and handwritten, was found to be slightly inaccurate, with at least one person listed on the manifest that was not on the plane, and at least one person not listed on the manifest that was on the plane. And in addition, at the last minute, at least 2 of the presidential aides that were on the plane had been shuttled off and directed to go and get on Air Force Two, reportedly because of their hysterical emotional state, but likely more due to the fact that Air Force One was not designed to have 40 people on it, and those folks were lower on the pecking order than others that needed truly to be there for the flight back. As we mentioned in the last episode, the 3 pool reporters that were high profile and on the flight that day were Merriman Smith, Charles Roberts, and Sid Davis. They weren't finished with their work when the swearing-in was over. In fact, their work on the plane that day had just begun. They would begin to try and piece together as much of the story of the assassination as they could at that moment, with many of the eyewitness participants right there and captive on the plane. And it was their job to sort through the delicate process of trying to talk to many of them and tease out the story in the midst of such heart-wrenching reflection that was going on all over the plane. That was a tough task at best. But even though these 3 reporters had ongoing working relationships with many of the officials, Johnson would, more than once, come back to these 3 and ask if they were getting all the facts that they needed. He was anxious to have the story out too. As Air Force One got underway and began to race through the sky, an odd but strangely predictable dynamic began to overtake all who were in its contained and confined space. The Kennedy people were congregating in the aft of the plane with the president's body, and the Johnson people were occupying the rest of the plane. But it was a segregated flight, so to speak, and there, as they all settled in for the flight, the emotions of the Kennedy group would raise the temperature in the cabin. Some of them could hardly believe that Air Force One had been commandeered by the new president, and that the old one was now taking the trip back in a bronze casket, and that his closest confidants and trusted friends were not being given the opportunity to be alone with him for what would most certainly be their last, best private party together, only this time to celebrate a life well lived and all too short. Talk to a military leader in the middle of a military campaign when a soldier is lost. He'll tell you about the seriousness of maintaining your composure and your focus for the sake of your own safety and the sake of the safety of the men and the women around you, and finally for the sake of the mission itself, even when that soldier is someone you have come to know and love. Those cool-headed and probably cold feelings and related actions and responses by the new Johnson team were undoubtedly an exacerbation to a highly tense and emotional environment on the plane. General Godfrey McHugh would be a poster boy for the rift that was present in the 2 camps. After refusing to talk to Johnson at Parkland about transportation and telling his aides that Johnson had his own plane, McHugh would later make the situation even worse for himself when he would tell Malcolm Kilduff, "I have but one president, and he is in that casket." He would be one of the first of President Kennedy's staff to be dismissed as Johnson took over the administration. In some ways, it was easy to understand the emotions that day. They were just raw. Throughout the entire flight, there was a burst of crying that continued and ran across a large number of people on the plane. like electricity jumping from one wire to another. There was probably no one on the staff that saw Kennedy more and more often than Evelyn Lincoln, his secretary. She was sobbing, and she was emblematic of all those close to the president on the plane, some of them letting go in similar fashion, others with just tears streaming down their faces, others with the agony of the moment written all over it. Behind the stateroom is where the casket was lashed and strapped in, along the left-hand side of the airplane, and Jackie was sitting right there next to it. It was bright, shiny, and beautiful as it entered Parkland Hospital, but the process to get it to Love Field, including first the shoving match for the body that occurred in the hallway at Parkland, and then the ride to Love Field, followed by the not-so-slick carpenter work done by an axe that was needed to make it fit through the door of Air Force One. Well, all of that had taken its toll. It was missing its handles, and it was chipped and scratched, and there were broken bolts where the handles had been. Soon the Kennedy clan would all get settled in the aft of the plane, surrounding Jackie and the coffin in an envelope of safety. There was Jackie, General McHugh, and the Irish Mafia trying to find peace in that crowded area. Beside that coffin, Jackie Kennedy began to cry for the first time. "Oh, Kenny, what's going to happen?" she would ask Kenneth O'Donnell. In his madness, born of the moment, O'Donnell would answer, "You want to know something, Jackie? I don't give a damn." It hit her when he said that. She answered back, "Oh, you're right. You're right. Just nothing matters now but what you've lost." Dr. Berkeley, the president's personal physician, would soon join them in the rear of the plane. As he progressed down the hallway, he would happen to peer into the bedroom where Jackie had taken her glove off. It was there, and dried stiff as a cast, as though her hand were still in it. Dr. Berkeley would go and find Mary Gallagher, one of Jackie's ladies-in-waiting, and point to the glove, doing so with his own blood-stained arm. "Put it away somewhere," he said. "Don't crush it." Kennedy was Irish, and there were a lot of Irishmen on board that day, members of Kennedy's so-called Irish Mafia. Irish men don't lose their brethren without raising a glass to toast their beloved and mourn their loss. And today was no exception, even on an airplane, even with the Johnson team just steps away. And with the events that had occurred, there was no doubt that a good stiff drink might calm the souls of all who could partake. Ken O'Donnell rises to his feet. "You know what I'm going to have, Jackie? I'm going to have a hell of a stiff drink. I think you should, too." "What will I have?" Jackie asks. "I'll make it for you. I'll make you a scotch." Jackie purportedly had never had a scotch in her life, but she had one then, saying, "Now is as good a time as any to start." It was for anyone to believe that Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy had gotten through all those years with the Kennedy clan without even a sip of scotch. This would be the beginning of the pseudo-Irish wake. They would all partake, with Kilduff gulping down gin and with the rest consuming numerous bottles of scotch. Those Kennedy men would soon recall the Celtic songs loved by the man in the box. Filled with emotion, their thoughts and discussions began to turn to the funeral and how it should be organized, and how this should be the last, best send-off to their old friend, and to Jackie's husband, and to the leader of the free world. They went on to discuss the history of the funerals of other U.S. presidents and began to discuss Lincoln's, and it seemed to them that Lincoln's funeral was the perfect point of reference, and that meant parades and horses pulling black carriages and a riderless horse representing a fallen leader. Even at these early moments, the idea of where to bury JFK and possibly adorning the grave with an eternal flame, those thoughts were already underway. The Irish Mafia was, of course, from Boston, and it was their choice that such flame be lit in the beloved president's hometown, right next to the grave of his son, Patrick. As it would be said, father and son and city forever united. O'Donnell tells Jackie not to let anyone change her mind about that. But Jackie was not yet revealing what she was already thinking. Ultimately, she would reveal that the final resting place was to be Arlington, Virginia, at Arlington National Cemetery. It was the more elegant and fitting final place of rest for a man who had risked his life in World War II, suffering injuries that might have permanently disabled many. And instead, he went on to become a United States Senator and then the President of the United States, and then finally giving his mortal life fully away to the nation as its President on November 22nd, 1963. Thank you for listening to episode 61 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 62. Today is the last in a series of episodes which takes us on an epic trip from Love Field in Dallas to Andrews Air Force Base. On a personal note, I've been on a bit of a wander over the last 2 weeks, so sorry about how long it's taken to get out this last episode to you. But the good news is the autopsy starts tomorrow. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 62 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. It was scribbled in his own handwriting on a single sheet of official stationery from Air Force One. 4 points. It's preserved today, actually. But just 3 were filled in. Staff, cabinet, leadership, pencil beside the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Those were the 3 words that Lyndon Johnson wrote as he began to emerge from the fog, too overwhelmed to complete the 4th. He was nearly by himself, racing across the sky, almost at Mach speed. A concept of the modern world that his grandfather, or perhaps even his father, would scarcely understand, wondering if he was ever going to make it home again. Home was far away, and he was going far from it, not to it. But at this moment, he was tasked with maintaining order, rebuilding, and administration, one that had just been decimated by the loss of one of the most charismatic men to walk the earth in recent memory. Handsome, intellectual, yet playful, steely, sexual, sensitive, hard as nails when it was required. This JFK had the full Monty, as they say. Johnson was not that man, despite all that he was, and he was a lot in his own right. one of the most powerful men to ever walk the Senate floor in the history of this country. But as mountainous as that was, it was not comparable to JFK. And Johnson knew it. Johnson had a bigger-than-life history of working the phones, working the flesh. It was part of his political being, and he was reverting back to his core competencies. In those days, there were limitations to phone calls from the skies, even on Air Force One. He pushed the limit of the technology and made as many as the technology would allow him on the plane that day. The biggest impediment in some ways was the transmission and reception lag. This occurred when a plane was in the air. It made the back and forth of a conversation quite difficult at times, not like today. There was a lot to contemplate in those moments. Shooting a president creates chaos everywhere. The stock market in New York closed early that day after beginning a freefall. It's hard to estimate how important the development of an official narrative is if you're in the head spot, the spot that has the responsibility of telling everyone else officially what happened and what is happening. I don't like that fact, but personally, I understand it. I understand how this whole business got started. I understand why it got started, and so should you. Like the elegant twisting and turning of two dancers out there by themselves and commanding the dance floor, the rhythm in the song comes with a story, written or unwritten. The flow of events takes over, nudged a little one way or the other, as much as can be done by the force at hand. And there were many of them in this story of the JFK assassination. That is why the panoply of this story is so hard to follow, and now nearly impossible to uncover all the truth. Much of this story is covered with morose talk and feelings, and I know that sometimes it's hard to stay with it. So to the listeners of this podcast, I get that. So thank you for that, for staying with it. But if you're still listening at this stage, you too know that this was truly a loss for not just us. I mean, just us in this country. It was a loss for the world, because not often does a man like this come along, really, in the history of the world. Just not that often. Sir Laurence Olivier stopped a performance at London's Old Vic Theatre. He announced the news of JFK's death, and he asked the audience to stand as the orchestra played, yes, the Star-Spangled Banner. Big Ben tolled for an hour. In Berlin, the city that had so loved JFK, well, 60,000 gathered for a torchlight procession. Even Moscow residents cried in the street. Whatever might have invaded your mind over the last year or so about this country, our country here in America, the ugliness of the assault on the Capitol and the sense of desperation you must have had in life in order to get to that point and to do that. And the same goes for the violent protesting in many cities about race relations. Well, there was a moment right then in 1963 when the whole world stood and saluted and placed their hand on their chest and blew a kiss across the water. If you could weigh the loss, it would have tilted the world at that moment. But in the beautiful words of the songwriter and singer Carole King, you have to get up every morning with a smile on your face and show the world all the love in your heart. And at a time like this, that was especially necessary by the peoples of the world, because this was inexplicable, regardless of what your political persuasion was. There were more practical communications that should have occurred in those moments of chaos that didn't. While Rufus Youngblood's wife was contacted almost immediately and relieved of the trauma that came with the wait, the trauma that came with the anxiety associated with the unknown, you see, she was informed that her husband was safe and was not one of the Secret Service agents that had purportedly been shot that day. Not so for the wife of William Greer, the driver of President Kennedy's limousine. She would wait long hours before confirmation of that was received. Trauma takes many forms in such an event of this nature. The November sun set quickly as the plane moved east, but a different darkness settled in the cockpit. Colonel Swindle would position the plane over the sky to avoid the turbulence below. Such an appropriate metaphor for all that was going on in the country, on the ground at that moment. Johnson would make his way into the stateroom and ask for Bill Moyers, Jack Valenti, and Liz Carpenter to come meet with him. "I want you to put something down for me to say when we land at Andrews," he said. "Nothing long. Make it brief. We'll have plenty of time later to say more." Johnson got 3 drafts on what to say as he stepped off the plane, one from each of them. He himself read them and then put them together in an edited version, what he would use in his first words to the world. He was sober as a cow that day, and he stayed that way. Johnson was a notorious drinker, but not on that flight back from Dallas. He drank coffee on the way back to Washington. The White House communications team tried several times to put through a condolence message from Queen Elizabeth. They finally passed it along, in addition to 3 or 4 other calls from heads of state, many of them finally received by General Clifton's aide. While he wasn't able to receive them all in the air, at least Johnson would get many of the messages later that night when he was back in Washington. It's hard to imagine a circumstance where the President of the United States is that high up, literally in rarefied air, and with such pressing priorities. You know, when messages from the Queen of England have a hard time getting to him directly, that is rarefied air and circumstance. But that was the case. As happens in moments like this, men who have been loyal to the predecessor begin to plan their own departure. On the plane that day, Johnson would initially call Kenny O'Donnell in for a moment and then subsequently ask for his presence 3 more times during the flight, all but the first rebuffed by O'Donnell. In the only encounter with Johnson pleaded with O'Donnell to stay on, telling him how much he needed him, how much Johnson, a man from the Deep South, needed a bridge to the northern part of the country, to the Easterners and the Eastern establishment that controlled so much, and that Johnson, as powerful as he was in his own right, was far from being accepted by that constituency, at least at that moment, and as he knew so well, that he likely would never really be a part of it. O'Donnell was non-committal at that moment, to be expected, but the real answer was already known. He was going away from and not leaning into the new presidency. It was a tragic ending for him, really, his own ending that started on that day and ended less than a decade later. That is, O'Donnell's life as a whole. And it was after such a glorious crescendo that had come in the last 3 years. The clock really was ticking for him. It's a good lesson to all of us. In whatever endeavors we undertake, they should all be undertaken at God's speed. Not everybody wanted out. There are always the ones who don't feel that way about the new boss, and then there are those where the power of their roles is intoxicating to them. Malcolm Kilduff was one such example in the administration. He quickly gravitated to the new president and pivoted out of the Kennedy camp. Whether it was for a sense of duty to the country in such an important moment and position as a White House spokesperson, or whether it was just loyalty to Johnson, or a little bit of both. And I sense it was the latter. It was, by definition, a pivot away from the Kennedys and the Irish Mafia. Pilots are infamous for being cool under pressure. Remember Sully over the Hudson River? Colonel Swindle was a highly respected pilot, but his affinity for the president penetrated whatever armor a pilot wears. He would say, as he reached 41,000 feet, that he would begin to understand the gravity of the circumstance that had just happened that day. Later, he would describe it as suddenly realizing that President Kennedy was dead. He felt the world had ended, and it became a struggle to continue. the thing that he loved the most, to fly. Well, things had changed. That flight had changed things for him too now. With that, he would go on to say, I know that I personally will never again enjoy flying as I did before. Of this group that was so close to the president and took this solemn ride home with him, each of them had their own experience. Each of them had to cope in some ways just as the rest of the world did. But they knew him. It was more. It was more personal than that. It was much more. Conversations were going on in pieces among the group, and much of it was therapy for the trauma they were all experiencing. Each trying to console, each trying to find consolation. Evelyn Lincoln, at a loss for words at one point, turned and said to Jackie, "Everything's going to be all right." Jackie just looked at her and said, "Oh, Mrs. Lincoln." There was something about that coffin, too. No one would touch it throughout the flight, and there were many around it. So much conveyed among all of them, not taken down, and at this point in history now just taken to the grave. Many of them on the plane that day with their own elements of guilt. Bill Greer as the driver, Kenny O'Donnell as the one who gave the order to remove the bubble top. Surely what the president commanded, but still, there was just plenty of guilt to go around. At one point, Jackie Kennedy openly talked about the parallels of martyrdom between her husband and Abraham Lincoln. It was a theme that would dominate the entire flight. Jackie had always been cognizant of her husband's legacy. Kennedy was an impressive student of the history of the world. In some ways, Jackie too. She would wonder, what would the world say about this man who had so many faces and facets? What would be said in that gut-wrenching emotional moment? And perhaps more importantly, what would be said afterward about this man that was now, most assuredly, assigned a role in history that was bigger than life? There was much for Johnson and his team to do in that short 2 hours or so on the plane. Among the more important calls they would make, Johnson and Lady Bird would call JFK's mother. "Mrs. Kennedy," Johnson started out, "I wish to God there was something I could say to you, and I want to tell you that we're grieving with you," he said. Rose Kennedy would respond as only she could, her full faithfulness and Boston decorum on display. "Thank you very much. That's very nice. I know you loved Jack, and he loved you," she replied in a way that was seemingly devoid of the emotion you might expect from a mother who had just lost a favored son. Unfortunately, she had practice at it already in life, having lost 2 children before Jack. Nothing less than a dreadful circumstance for a mother, and she would lose more in the future. "If there is anything we can do," Lady Bird began. "Thank you, Lady Bird. Thank you, Mr. President," Mrs. Kennedy said, ending the call, seemingly with no more that could be said. Jackie continued to think about the funeral, wanting Cardinal Cushing to do the Mass, the same man who had married them. She would have the Italian tenor Luigi Vina sing Ave Maria at the funeral. Jack would have loved it, she thought. Johnson would continue with the busy work of forming a new government. He had concerns, rightly so, about the Russians. Still little was known about who was involved. While he was on a plane, he kept a keen interest in what was happening with the suspect back in Dallas as well. Who was this Lee Harvey Oswald? "It's the Kremlin that worries me," Johnson would recall later. "It can't be allowed to detect a waiver. Khrushchev is asking himself right now what kind of man I am. He's got to know he's dealing with a man of determination." Maybe as part of that, Johnson rejected the idea of a secret landing of Air Force One for security reasons, something that had been suggested by his advisors. He wanted the landing of the plane to be as normal as it could be, with normal access by the press. In the aft of the plane, the morosity of the moment continued. there was an important conversation that had not been had yet. It was one that was needed to be had with Jackie herself. And the task of doing it was left up to Dr. George Berkeley, Kennedy's personal physician. Dr. Berkeley would have to sit down and tell Jackie that her husband's body would be the subject of an autopsy. It would be required. When Dr. Berkeley delivered the news, Jackie was surprised, even though she was there and witnessed what had happened in Dallas at Parkland. She would still ask, why? Why would it need to be done? And she even got demonstrative, saying that it doesn't have to be done. Berkeley was left with the unenviable task of being firm with the First Lady and insisting that it did have to be done. The bullet that killed her husband was evidence, and it would need to be removed. At this moment, there was still a living suspect in the murder of the president, and all the anticipated elements of a murder trial were still applicable in the circumstance. Little did they know of what would happen just 2 days later. Berkeley would give Jackie some choices: Walter Reed Army Hospital or Bethesda Naval Hospital, or any other hospital of her own choosing. He was desperate to help ease Jackie's mind, but still take care of the task. Jackie thought about it and decided that JFK was a naval officer, and so the autopsy should be done at Bethesda Naval Hospital. As they got closer to landing, Jackie would once again be asked about the possibility of changing out of her blood-stained clothes, and she again repeated her own personal litany. No, let them see what they have done to Jack. She was already lamenting that Cecil Stoughton's photograph was after she had wiped Jack's blood from her face. They would then offer up the idea that she could exit out the other side of the plane and avoid the throng of reporters. And again, she said, no, we are going out of the plane the normal way. Just as the new president was determined to stare down the Soviets, Jackie was determined for the world to see the results of the evil that had been activated that day, regardless of where that evil had come from. And she would make one more request that day that was to be honored. She would insist that instead of the honor guard carrying the coffin off of Air Force One that day, that his friends, just like they had done in Dallas to carry him on the plane, would carry him off. Only this time, they would at least have the benefit of using a scissors lift. A cargo carrier of sorts, a big box that was able to move up and down on a scissor-like device. It was a good thing to have, especially after the amount of alcohol that had been consumed on the flight by the president's friends. In fact, it might have been considered essential equipment for this last faithful exit from Air Force One for the slain president. Rufus Youngblood had strongly recommended to the new president that he go directly to the White House and stay the night there, where the security was tightest. But Johnson, to his credit, resisted that urging, and he insisted on going home to his own estate in the Elms. He was at least momentarily conscious of how that would look and conscious of the privacy of Jackie. That would not last long, but for this first night, it was decided and honored. There is something about the solace and comfort of an airplane that is 41,000 feet up in the air, safe from most everything but weather and the mechanical failure of the plane itself. And there are moments in life where such fear of those things is totally subordinated to all of those fears still on the ground, safe from the evil that seems to lurk everywhere in moments like the ones they were experiencing. That plane ride, it would not last long enough. Eventually, they were back in Washington, and Colonel Swindle was landing the plane at Andrews Air Force Base. All the ordinary and extraordinary preparations had been made. There were cars lined up to take some of the passengers. There were helicopters that would take the new president to the White House. There were ambulances and more cars that would head to Bethesda for the autopsy. There was a debate over whether to take the coffin by helicopter, but immediately the weight of the coffin and the nighttime flight gave way to a decision to transport the body by ground ambulance. When the plane came to its stop on the tarmac, the reality of what was to come began to seep back into the circumstance. Johnson would take the lead and say, "Let's get everybody together." And with that command, the bulk of the passengers made their way to the rear of the plane, where they would go down the stairs of Air Force One. There was a sequence of departure that seemed to be thought about and ready to go. The Kennedys closest to the door with the casket, then Johnson, then his aides and the congressman behind him. Johnson, as he stood waiting, would kiss the hand of a Kennedy aide. What came next was totally unexpected. The Attorney General had made his way to Andrews Air Force Base and had boarded the plane. And as the entire passenger group was set to disembark through the rear door, Robert Kennedy had stepped onto the plane through the front door of Air Force One. There were tears flowing down the face of the Attorney General, and he would head toward the rear of the plane and aggressively make his way toward the back in search of Jackie. Politely but firmly, he was pushing past other passengers in a relentless quest to find Jackie before she left the plane. Excuse me, he said, pushing through all the people in the rear of the chain. "Where's Jackie? I want to be with Jackie." In his singular quest to find her, he pushed right past the new president, shunning the extended hand of the man from Texas and saying nothing to the new president as he pushed by him in the cabin. He would find Jackie and be by her side as the passengers disembarked and the scissors lift was put in place to move the casket off the plane. Robert and Jackie would be right there for all the world to see as they accompanied their friends and colleagues and the casket of the president off the plane. The press corps was in full force. There were also diplomats, military personnel, and just lookers-on, too. And as President Johnson himself now stepped off the plane and up to a collection of microphones, the whole world was listening, and the cameras were rolling, and it was most certainly a piece of American history never to be forgot. Like so many moments that had already occurred on that November day, the 5:59 p.m. touchdown assured that the entire contingent would be disembarking in the darkness of the fall, and that Johnson would address the world in a darkness that seemed to match the morosity of the moment. Johnson had readied himself before touchdown, shaving and trying to freshen up before he would have to make his way in front of the cameras and newsmen. Senators Everett Dirksen, Hubert Humphrey, and Mike Mansfield waited near the press area. Nearby, helicopters were waiting to take the new president and the new First Lady and her widowed predecessor to the White House. But those plans would soon change, as Jackie would not go to the White House, but would insist on accompanying her dead husband to Bethesda for the autopsy. Johnson would step up and read just 7 sentences of humbling, heartfelt words spoken by a countryman from Texas in the aftermath of one of the most tragic political circumstances in the nation's short history. After the editing on the plane, the words of the three became his. This was a message delivered in a way that could be received at that moment by every American. He would say this: "This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bears. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask only for your help and God's."
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. For me, it is a deep personal tragedy. I know that the world shares the sorrow that Mrs. Kennedy and her family bear. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
Thank you for listening to episode 62 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 63. You know, for those of you following this podcast closely, you'll recall that I began promising autopsy episodes quite a while back. You might have already asked, what is taking him so long? Well, certainly the journey back from Dallas was interesting and had its own highlights, and I hope that you really enjoyed them. And I think that was a wander that was worth taking. But now it's time. Time for a series of episodes on the autopsy. This part of the story, perhaps understandably, has been the most difficult set of episodes that I have produced thus far in the podcast series. I have made and remade the episodes that represent the inevitable wander that has to go on in the middle of this medical labyrinth. The autopsy should have been a mountain of medical evidence that was dispassionate and that was allowed to stand on its own to point to the truth, whatever that truth was. For a number of reasons, that just didn't happen. It wasn't a mountain of medical evidence, and by some standards, people might say it wasn't even a mound. But like most medical evidence, it's complicated enough that you can still get lost in it. I certainly did. I've been around doctors and clinicians a good part of my adult life as I made a career in the hospital industry. Just days into my first role as a hospital administrator, I purchased a medical dictionary, Mosby's. I still have that same dictionary today. It's been invaluable because, like every profession, the medical profession has its own vernacular. Nothing takes the place of a good anatomy course because most everything emanates around the unique mapping in geography of the human body. It's the basis for a good many of the most common anatomical terms. While I never took an anatomy course, I did, over the course of my own administrative career, religiously use that Mosby dictionary. I remember very distinctly the first word I had to look up more than 30 years ago. As a finance person, I found myself chairing a typical committee that you might find in any hospital today. It was a utilization review committee that monitors resource consumption and tracks patient stays in the hospital. The word was nosocomial. It's not intuitive, at least to a non-clinician, but it means or relates to a hospital-acquired infection. So in other words, a nosocomial infection would be one that you acquired while you were in the hospital itself. Such a thing is a red flag if you are running a hospital, and such things are carefully monitored and followed up on if they occur. My point in telling you that story has nothing to do with my own personal experience. Rather, it was to give you a flavor of how unintuitive it is to listen to medical terminology and evidence related to an autopsy. That one word, nosocomial, is not something that you can phonetically say and then automatically understand. Understand that what it meant was a hospital-acquired infection. You really do have to study and learn the definition all by itself. Well, that's the way it is for most people anyway. And here's the dilemma for us on this podcast. I guess, really, on any podcast that would be covering this topic or a similar one. We're not going to medical school as a prerequisite to listening to the next series of episodes on the autopsy, and honestly, that makes it tough for all of us. When lay people such as us wander into a technical area, there is always the risk that the untrained eye and mind will just, well, frankly, get it wrong. Even with 30 years in the hospital business as an administrator, as a non-clinician, I find the story of the autopsy boggling, confusing, and in the end, mind-numbing. But also in the end, I concluded that there were a few things that indeed make this part of our wander relevant to you as a podcast listener. Indeed, to you as a member of the jury. So I set out to bring at least a bit more clarity to this topic as seen through the simple mind of a non-technical observer. True to form in this small subset of episodes, we include some more storytelling, and there is no doubt that the topic of JFK's autopsy is replete with circumstances that allow for storytelling. So, you'll get your dose of that too. If you've been listening to the podcast all the way through from the beginning, you know I've used a lot of euphemisms and double-talking colloquialisms and sayings and whatever you want to call all that stuff. One of them that I like the best is when you see something that clearly doesn't add up, doesn't make any sense, doesn't adhere to any logic pattern at all, and seems so unusual that, on its surface, it's probably just a lie, or at least a deception of some sort. But its true origins of defect are undetectable. Well, in that case, I might just say, that dog don't hunt. There's a lot of cases in the autopsy where that dog don't hunt. It's already November. It's hunting season, isn't it? Well, let's get the dogs out and spend a Saturday night letting them run, and let's see what they catch up to. You know, a dog running on a Saturday night might catch the scent of a raccoon or a rabbit. On the other hand, he or she might run into a coyote or a bear. That is the dilemma associated with running around in the woods in the middle of the night, isn't it? That is one reason why many of the early assassination researchers tried to stay on some level of tight formation, hunting in packs, so to speak. It was dangerous territory in the early 1960s, and the autopsy was a dangerous part of the woods. It's only sport now. Too much time has passed, and most, if not all of the characters are gone now. But the story itself remains mysterious and curiously inviting. In the end, the story of the autopsy may not have really anything to do with the clinical conclusions themselves, but rather whether or not such conclusions were altered or obscured by the characters involved. Because if that is true, it was a conspiracy of a different kind. It was no longer a question of what group or groups of people might have come together to shoot the president. It was now a question of which government officials or government entities were engaged in covering it up. And why? Because there was no one present and conducting or controlling that autopsy but government officials. So you can see how we are now entering a part of the story that very well could encompass the darker side of what everyone feared about what had really happened to JFK and what forces were really involved. And like other parts of the JFK story, there were real-life, non-sinister forces also bearing down on what occurred. As a podcast listener and a member of our jury, part of the task at hand is to listen carefully to what gets presented and determine if we can unravel some of the nefarious from some of the innocuous. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 63 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. As they stepped off the plane together, Robert Kennedy would again let Jackie know that there was a helicopter waiting to take her to the White House. just like the trooper she had been in every moment so far of this horrific scene, she would turn to Robert and tell him no, that she was going to ride with Jack and be with him. She was going to Bethesda. Lieutenant Sam Bird was mortified when he and his honor guard had been asked to stand down. Perhaps one of the most concerning ceremonial aspects to him at that moment was that the president's coffin was being moved without the presence of an American flag on top of it. Men of honor in the military have a certain code for the fallen and the dead, and at this moment it was not being followed for the President of the United States, their Commander-in-Chief. General Godfrey McHugh had asked everyone to clear out, and he told the honor guard that he and others on the plane would take care of moving this monstrous bronze casket out and down. The scissors lift was the wrong size, and it actually couldn't rise high enough to be flush with the airplane exit. It made for a messy step down. Eventually, though, they would all be off, and the casket too. Major General Philip Wheel was the commanding officer of the Military District of Washington, or MDW, and he was going through the process of ensuring that the helicopter and its pilot, which was under his purview, was ready to go. It was an H-21 helicopter that had been assigned to take President Kennedy back to Bethesda so that the autopsy could be performed. But now the pilot himself had just heard of a change of plans. The body was now going by ground ambulance. Sam Bird's honor guard never got a chance to bring President Kennedy off the plane, but they would scamper back to Bethesda on the helicopter with another chance to help unload as the ambulance arrived there. Jackie would get into the ambulance and, rather than sitting in the front, decided that she wanted to sit in the rear, closer to Jack, closer to the casket. The doors were locked, and she struggled to get in. An odd and perhaps poetically fitting moment as they arrived back in Washington. The ambulance was a two-way proposition that day. Coming from the hospital, it carried several medical personnel. Lyndon Johnson had a known heart condition, and so the hospital had dispatched a nurse and another clinician to address the new president. They quickly made their way out of the ambulance as it began to ready itself with a new group of passengers for the return trip with the president's body. Bill Greer, the driver of the limousine in Dallas, would be the driver of the ambulance carrying the president's body. Roy Kellerman, another Secret Service agent who sat next to him in the limousine in Dallas, would also climb into the ambulance. Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy would make their way into the ambulance as well. It was stuffed, and yet it still couldn't hold all of the entourage that was going to make its way to Bethesda and surround Jackie. There were more cars behind them as well. Still, Secret Service agent Paul Landis was assigned to riding with the Kennedys, and he would also make his way into the ambulance. Now it seemed to be full, and just when there wasn't enough room for anyone else, Admiral Berkeley, the last passenger, would pile in anyway at the end, ending up on Landis's lap for the entire ride. Soon, the drive to Bethesda was underway, and Robert Kennedy would reach forward and open the plastic partition that separated the front and the back of the ambulance seats. He would say to Roy Kellerman, who was sitting in the front, "Did you hear they apprehended a fellow in Dallas?" By this time, that night, the world was awash with the news about Lee Harvey Oswald. Apparently, though, at that moment, Kellerman did not know, which is somewhat odd in that a number of the inhabitants of the plane had been watching television news on Air Force One in the plane's stateroom, and the news of Oswald's capture and detention had been broadcast and seen by at least a few on the plane prior to the plane's departure from Dallas. Somehow, that information did not spread like a virus through the plane to everyone. I guess the sorrow of that moment, those moments, was so intense that it would have been poisonous to inject the agony of a real face, a real name, related to the assassin. It was just too raw at that moment to think about such things. Kellerman acknowledged the comment and indicated that, at some point when they got to Bethesda, he would come and talk to Bobby. There was plenty of time to talk on this trip that took about 45 minutes. Jackie would speak on a myriad of things, including the fact that she did not want any undertakers involved. She wanted everything done by the Navy. Why she made these statements is not clear, but she specifically asked Berkeley and others to ensure that these next crucial, critical hours would ensure that. I suppose part of it was a privacy concern. I am sure she could hardly fathom the idea of pictures of the president, the dead president, floating around and potentially seen in the public realm. That, for sure, was something that she and others in the Kennedy family did not want to happen. There were other conversations in the ambulance on the ride over. Jackie and Bobby talked briefly about the swearing in. It was the first time that Bobby Kennedy would hear that Johnson had told Jackie on the plane that he had talked with Bobby and that Bobby had okayed a swearing in Dallas. It was but one of the new president's actions that would come to startle Bobby on that day and in the ensuing days to come. Bobby made it clear to Jackie and others in the car that he had not suggested that a swearing in take place in Dallas. Jackie decided it was time to tell the story of exactly what happened in the plaza, and so, right there in the ambulance, she told it as she saw it to those listening. Certainly, they had their own visuals already. Most of them were there. But she was telling Robert. He wasn't ready to hear it, but he was also not ready to tell her no. So he just listened quietly as she relived the horrible moments of the shooting itself. The route to Bethesda would take them close to the center of the city, where they would pass nearby to the U.S. Capitol and the mall area, including the Federal Triangle, where so many of the highest administrative offices of the government are located, including the offices of many who worked for Robert Kennedy himself. This was the seat of our national government, and it was a place that these Kennedy men knew all so well, and both of them were in the ambulance together at that moment. So many Americans in government had been watching from their offices that day. The landing at Andrews Air Force Base and the unloading of the casket was captured live on television, so those working in the Capitol that day knew it would only be a few minutes before that ambulance passed somewhere nearby on its fateful trip to Bethesda. Many of them would stay late in their offices to watch, hoping to get a glimpse of the ambulance and whatever motorcade would come with it, which turned out to be a police motorcycle escort, but with no sirens. JFK did not like the sirens. There were essentially 3 points of entry at Bethesda as the ambulance approached. Captain Robert O. Canada was an MD in the United States Navy, and he was the commanding officer of Bethesda Naval Hospital. The hospital itself was but one unit at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. Captain Canada was unsure which gate the ambulance would come through. In preparation, the hospital had made sure that there was a chaplain and a nurse at all 3 locations. There was no secrecy about what was happening, and a large crowd began to gather around Bethesda. The hospital compound itself in those days had little, if any, protective fencing or gates that would prevent crowds from getting close. And in fact, that's exactly what they did. They all came and parked as close as they could, and they walked in as closely as they could in some sort of tribute to the fallen president. It was a solemn crowd that was just there to watch this historic event. I guess the way people do, as a way to grieve themselves. They did this as the ambulance drove up. They would watch Jackie and others exit from the ambulance. Captain Canada and Rear Admiral Calvin Galloway would greet the members of the entourage as they pulled up in the ambulance and got out. Captain Canada and Robert Kennedy would help Jackie out of the car. Others from Jackie's entourage would soon approach the gathering group as these folks arrived in other cars that followed the ambulance to Bethesda. Canada and Galloway would quickly usher them to the elevator and take them to one of the 2 VIP suites, with the Kennedys going to the suite on the 17th floor, the penthouse of the building. they would need all the room there because soon there would be an entourage of the Kennedys' closest family and friends that would come to Bethesda. They had been waiting for her to arrive at the White House, but when they received news that Jackie was not coming directly there, many of them decided that it was time to head to Bethesda to be with her. Among that group was Ben Bradlee and his wife, Toni Bradley. Ben Bradlee was the now famous and iconic editor of the Washington Post, and he and Toni were close friends with the Kennedys and especially President Kennedy. Years later, he would play a pivotal role as editor of the Post in uncovering the Watergate scandal. As they all piled out of the car and made their way into the main lobby, Godfrey McHugh would walk behind the rest of the crowd and catch up with Rear Admiral Galloway, and with other high-ranking naval officers as well. McHugh informed Galloway that he was going now to get to the morgue for the autopsy and the embalming. It was at that moment that he let Galloway know that Mrs. Kennedy did not want an undertaker involved. Galloway was taken aback. He would immediately tell McHugh that he just didn't have the facilities for that at Bethesda. He would go on to say that, "I highly recommend a funeral parlor." McHugh kept at it. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He said, "These are the family wishes. Isn't it possible?" Galloway knew that this was a sensitive moment, so his response was, "It's not impossible, but it's difficult, though, and it might not be satisfactory." This began the start of an extended conversation about the possibilities and what was required to actually make such a thing happen. The back and forth took place over a 10 to 15-minute period, and all during that time, the ambulance stayed parked out front with McHugh close to it. It was clear from others watching this exchange that McHugh and Galloway were not in agreement. During the course of this exchange, two members of the Irish Mafia would enter the conversation. It was Kenny O'Donnell and Larry O'Brien. They reaffirmed for the Admiral what the good general had just told him, that the decision had been made, and it was the wish of the family that the Navy take care of the autopsy and the preparation of the body afterward. A decision that Galloway was not happy about, but there was nothing he could do about it. He had gotten his orders, so to speak. Now everyone would scurry up the elevator to the VIP suites to find solace once again, and then a silence took over the first floor, and General Godfrey McHugh found himself again beside the ambulance and alone with the president's casket. In the mad scene of the day that had continued all the way to Bethesda, this president's casket was seemingly abandoned right in the middle of a set change, so to speak. The players all scattered and getting ready for the next performance, leaving the dead president by himself and out front of the main entrance of the Naval Hospital in his bronze casket, just resting there in the rear of the gray ambulance that had carried him to Bethesda, awaiting the final jog on the campus and delivery of the casket and the body to the morgue. Thank you for listening to episode 63 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.